And as you probably are aware, we're going to be talking about incorporating families into CBTP. And I'm using the term family very broadly here, so essentially being anybody in the individual's life who they identify as supportive, natural support. Could be friends, could be partners, could be biological family of origin, could be adoptive family, anybody that the individual would identify as supportive or who might be involved in treatment. But just by way of some background, we think about CBTP as being this individual approach primarily, and when we're trained to do individual therapy, it's just that. We're typically focusing on the individual. And very frequently, I think what ends up happening is we don't necessarily think about the inclusion of the family, to the detriment often of the treatment. And so families frequently report wanting to be included in treatment, but feeling like they're being excluded. I think this is a really common refrain, particularly families supporting individuals with more serious mental health problems. And there's a number of issues around that, systems issues, particularly those that understandably really strongly endorse adult client privacy. It can make it very challenging then for families to engage and interact with providers if the adult is saying, I don't want my family involved. So how do we do that, and how do we respond to that? Clinician comfort can be a real issue, particularly, again, if the training has been very specific around individual work and hasn't been around consideration of the system, or how do we work with the system that the individual is really embedded within. And obviously client comfort as well. So it might feel very uncomfortable for the client to consider having family members participate in treatment. Families can be incredibly strong allies or may become allies through the process. I know working with clinicians around this and supporting clinicians to engage with families, there's often reports of maybe feeling overwhelmed by the system, particularly if there's chaos. And families are oftentimes the ones that are spending the most time with the individual. We as clinicians, 50 minutes a week, maybe more frequently if there's more intense need, but the families are doing the really intense support. And I heard Sarah there referring to the training that we have coming up in May. And this really gets to the heart of that we recognize that families are the people that are doing the most support and have obviously the very least exposure to the skills needed to support that individual. Just bear in mind, as we're talking about this, we're not talking about this as family therapy. If we're considering that a family may need systems-based or specific focused family therapy, then we should be referring out for that. This is just purely about how can we draw upon this existing support system to leverage the work that we're doing. So as we think about involving families in natural support systems within the individual CBTP work, obviously we need to consider some different factors. First of all, what are the family dynamics that might be at play? What conflict might there be? Support, history within the family in terms of interactions, attachment issues and consideration of that and how that might be playing out in the room now. Trauma and potential perpetrators of the trauma, or trauma where there may not have been perpetration within the family, but guilt around not feeling like they were able to protect the family member or the individual you're working with who maybe has been the recipient of the trauma, feeling like they weren't protected or I wasn't sufficiently supported. Huge issues to be thinking about coming into this. Client comfort. Oftentimes, if we're involving the family, some of the initial work may be around preparing the client for that work. So if it's constant, we'll get into some more specific examples in a second, so it'll become a little bit more obvious perhaps. But if we identify that having a session with a family member or multiple family members is going to be beneficial, it may be that as a number of sessions prior to that, we're really working to help the client themselves feel comfortable with that as it's going forward, feeling empowered to be able to speak up, setting boundaries and rules, and talking about what is on topic and what's definitely off topic. So oftentimes there's a lot of preparation that goes in before we're doing this family piece. Obviously, with any of our interventions around CBTP, they need to be clinically formulated, and this family intervention piece is driven by that formulation. In consideration of the family and client understanding of the psychosis and the experiences, and where is there agreement and where is there disagreement? Typically, I think we automatically assume that the family member is going to have a good insight, if you like, and be able to say, well, schizophrenia is this thing that I've read about and the research, and the client might be the one that's resisting and rejecting that. But I've certainly had experiences where it's been the other way around, where the young person has come and said, I'm really scared by my experiences. I really think it's consistent with schizophrenia. And my family are telling me that's not the case and it's just spirit. So kind of thinking about it within this cultural framework as well. Similarly, if we're inviting and working with the family themselves, to be thinking about a family mental health history, their current involvement with services or history of involvement with services, and experience of services overall. Have they been used to typically being distanced or felt like they were blamed by services? All of this is really going to influence what that interaction's like. Consideration and assessment of risk. And then the question when we have the family in the room is, who is the client? And for me, that remains my individual client. I think making people aware that we're not necessarily, like I say, we're not moving this family therapy approach. But having said that, if other family members are involved in services or if family therapy is indicated, then consideration of how we can all collaboratively work together as a team to really support the system is really important. So there certainly isn't an exhaustive list of ways in which families can be incorporated into treatment, but just some kind of things based on work that I've done and different ideas. So psychoeducation, ensuring that everybody's on the same page around different experiences is possible, not always possible. Certainly involving families in wellness planning, particularly if the family or the natural support are going to be the ones that are involved with that individual, might be the individuals that see and recognize changes in behavior or very, very early symptoms. They need to be really bought into what is the wellness plan, what might those symptoms be, and what are we going to do about them. They can be great allies for helping to execute behavioral experiments outside of the office and supporting interventions at home. So what skills am I going to help my loved one use when they're becoming really upset, and how do I offer those skills to that person in a way that they're going to be able to tolerate them in that moment. They might be individuals who can help support the tracking of symptoms. Now, with all of these, you want to make sure that nothing's being overly utilized. So this is where we want to be doing this in collaboration with the client and the family member, where tracking symptoms might be great, but we don't want to get to a situation where the family member is walking around the house with a pad and pen, tracking every single thing that the client does. It's going to become very unhelpful. So again, all of this done in collaboration with what feels comfortable and useful for the individual. It might be about aiding in reality checking or discussing alternatives to a situation. And if that's work that we're doing with our client, it can be incredibly helpful to have a family member on board and understanding that process so that they can act as that sounding board outside of the therapy office. It might be about supporting positive reinforcement and rewards. So how, again, is the family going to support a behavior change? Is that about a family movie night or being able to sit down together and play a board game or whatever feels good for that family, right? It has to work for them. And then engaging in problem solving. So once again, if that's something that we're working with the individual, it can be very helpful to have the family on board to understand those same steps and to be able to help the client think through those steps for problem solving rather than just jumping in with what you need to do now is you should be doing, right? Helping the person to think through these steps. We can't expect the family to just have those skills unless we offer to teach them ahead of time. Which actually is the very basis of multifamily group as well. So you can think about how that fits into other modalities too. So I'm just going to think very briefly about two different primary models of involvement, kind of the two ends of the spectrum, if you like. But I think all of this work can just be so fluid and can be different things at different times, again, depending on and driven by the formulation. So I think at one end of the spectrum, it's just this as-needed involvement of the family, where we might be focusing on a very specific topic. Like I said, depending on the client, we'll be planning for this session ahead of time. That might just be one session. It might be multiple sessions. And after the session with the family involved, debriefing, where we may be thinking about how did that problem solving go, how did the wellness planning go, how's the behavioral experiment gone, whatever it was we focused on. So the lead up, the actual session with the family, and then the debrief afterwards. And just a very quick example of this. So this is a client that I am seeing currently, I guess, calling him Damien for the purpose of this presentation. We've been doing weekly CBTP where we're targeting his delusions and his functioning and his auditory hallucinations as well. And his sister, who lives away, this is an adult client, had come home for the holidays, and there was a lot of conflict and tension in the home because Damien would send her repeated incomprehensible texts, very, very disorganized, using neologisms, very hard to follow, some language that was really quite triggering for her. And so we agreed to invite the sister into the session for one session to focus on problem solving around this. And so we prepared for the session with Damien, knowing that there was some tension and conflict. So what was the focus of the session going to be? And what were the rules for the session? What was okay for us to talk about openly? What were things that he'd shared with me that he wasn't yet comfortable with other people knowing? Who was going to speak and when? What would happen if it felt like his sister was speaking more, or if he didn't feel like he was able to really put his point across? So really having these rules laid out. His sister then joined us and initially reviewed the focus of the session and the rules. She had an opportunity to add to those rules, so it didn't just feel like she was being told what it was going to be. And we agreed upon a shared goal for the session, which was really trying to understand the text and the motivation and the reason why he sent these texts, which I had a good understanding of because of the formulation work that we'd done, but we also knew that she didn't, and seeing if it could come up with a different plan and hearing her perspective. We explored the behavior of sending these texts, developed a formulation whereby Damien was really able to share and explain what he was doing and why. So if we think about the formulation, the event being for him that he had this urge to communicate without getting too deeply into it, his black dog, that's his neologism for it, and the behavior would then be to send a text. And so what we tried to do in the session was fill in that blank, that thought, so that even if it didn't excuse the behavior, that these texts were kind of challenging and triggering for her, it helped her to understand how that urge and that behavior connected. And then to come up with a new plan, and she was able to share very, very coherently and clearly with him, I really, really enjoy hearing from you. But if you want to communicate, can you just check in, say, how are you doing? Or let me know you love me, if that's okay. Or just, ask me, let me know how you're doing, ask me how I'm doing. And so we agreed that those would be the type of text exchange that they would have. And then afterwards, we checked in on his experience of that family session, what it was like sharing that information with his sister that he'd never articulated to her before. And then the implementation of the intervention, which I'm pleased to say has been successful. And I haven't had any reports of him sending these messages that have been really triggering. He sent them to other people since, and we're applying the same method, but within the family system, been working quite nicely. On the other end of that spectrum is family involvement in every session, and how do we support this family CBTP approach, where again, the focus is still the client, but the whole family is involved. And here, I think there's a real opportunity for us to model curiosity and how to sit on the collaborative fence and how to communicate around psychosis and that being curious about the experience. We can develop a formulation as a group and incorporate different perspectives into this and identify skills and ways in which family members might be able to support the intervention. And so I find this particularly helpful where I have individuals who may be a little bit more isolated, who isolated in terms of their family as their main support, and without the family sort of rallying behind, not a lot's going to be getting done. The motivation is fairly low. and then discussion of who might be able to support that intervention at home. Who, is it mom? Is it dad? Is it stepdad? Is it brother? Who has the best skills to help support that individual to really get that going? So again, a quick example of what that is, or what that looked like with a client that I'm working with. This is somebody I've called Jackson, who this is somebody with a more long-standing history of psychosis, a very long time to engage and befriend. And our initial focus was really on supporting functioning and transition to independent living. And the family, and we did that individually, and that was going really nicely. And then the family started to request skills that they could use to support Jackson. And so we agreed, rather than me just meeting with them separately and telling them what they should do, maybe if they joined us, Jackson could actually support that. And so he could provide assistance around teaching the family what he needed to help facilitate this transition to independent living. So the family started to attend weekly sessions with Jackson, where I would really be modeling a lot of curiosity, a lot of redirection. If he became quite delusional, which he has the propensity to do in sessions when things get more triggering and anxiety provoking for him, how do we help sort of work around that and bring him back to a place where he can really think through the formulation and the skills needed? And I think a really big piece of it was having actual multiple perspectives in the room, where we could check in and he would have one perspective and I'd be like, oh, I'm not so sure that's my perspective. This is how I see it. And then mom would be like, well, this is how I see it. And stepdad would be like, well, this is how I see it. And so we could actually tolerate the uncertainty of, we have 4 different people with 4 different perspectives in the room right now. Isn't that interesting? I think that was a really nice piece for this client. The family were available in session to provide really positive feedback and reinforce successes. And this may sound not very CBT and maybe a little bit more relational, which is a big piece of CBTP anyway, but I would say really, really important shift in this session was when mom was able to say, I'm really proud of you and I really love you. And I don't think that was something that had really been directly communicated to that individual for a long, long, long time. And seeing him just light up, mom was able to do much more of that. And so it really reinforces the efforts that he puts in, and he does put a lot of effort in. And feedback from mom to me is that I just remember this quote because I love it so much, that watching you talk to Jackson is like watching a dance, and I'm learning how to do that dance. And that really resonated, because that's how it can often feel with our clients. That, oh, I said that, and now that person's getting triggered, so I'm going to go over here, but I'm being curious, I'm going to go, and you're leading the dance now, and now maybe I am. And it was really lovely that she picked up on that, and she is very effectively leading that dance. So I don't know if you've just got a couple of minutes for questions, but I will stop there and open it up.
Well on time, and it spurred a lot of thoughts and questions for me, and I'm sure for others. Do folks have questions that?
I have a question. This is Brittany from Frontier. So I have a family who has a Vietnamese background, and so mom is super supportive, and a 40-year-old client has had psychosis episodes since about 2006. Now mom I think struggles with the idea of her son not being able to kind of reconnect to the cultural norms of waking up early, being productive, and especially with the negative symptoms. And so she will make little comments like, you're getting fat, and he's not particularly large, but I guess for their family he is. So how do you address, I guess, positioning mom in a more supportive way while supporting the client?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and it's not, so like I talked about in a spectrum, and I guess the one area that I didn't talk about is the family session without the individual present. And so, if there is language that I would consider to be potentially detrimental to the individual, and that sounds relatively tame, but still potentially really hurting the individual, then is that something that you would want to potentially address with the mother separate to the session with the client? So talking through their motivation for doing that. Does she believe in doing that she's actually motivating the client, and she needs some psychoeducation on how that could be potentially demoralizing and maintaining the problem? And she just needs some additional skills to help motivate, but not in a way that kind of puts you down at the same time. So the one thing we might do to prepare, like I said, is having the client preparation session, but also maybe a family preparation session, and then let's bring it together. And then let's practice this. So can son give feedback on, when you say that, I just feel like staying in bed longer. That doesn't help. But actually, if you said to me, it's a beautiful day, let's go for a walk together, I might get out of bed then, right? So is there a way of sort of leveraging that feedback from client, but we might need to prepare mom ahead of time and just provide some of that psychoeducation, potentially.
Thank you so much.
Not at all. And I think negative symptoms are very culturally loaded as well. I mean, David Kingdon, who you guys are familiar with, really reflects on the US and England and the differences around expectations to return to functioning and to work. And so I think the exploration of that cultural piece is really important.
Jeremy also had a question that I'm going to read since his audio isn't working. It says, I'm curious what you'd recommend for clients who have limited supports who may want to help, but the client perceives as estranged. I had 2 clients who are only in their 20s but have no parents, but they have siblings, and they both avoid the idea of our team reaching out.
The siblings avoid the idea, or the client avoids the idea? Sorry, I'm reading it as well.
I think it's that the clients don't want the team to reach out to the siblings.
Yeah, and so actually, so both of those case examples I provided, neither one were immediately like, yay, great idea. Let's bring the family in. So that was some preparation, and I think that's where we look at that client comfort. Again, we can formulate that. What are the thoughts that the client has of these things that we can address ahead of time? Is the history there? Oh, well, whenever I get into a room with my sibling, they just talk over me, and they're gonna get you on side, and you're going to turn against me because that's what happened with our friend group. So things that we can really address ahead of time around that, setting those rules up. You can, just like any session, you can terminate the family session if it doesn't feel like it's going well, and I will support. But I would say with any of that, it's about sort of preparation and building up to. And it looks like from what you just said, the siblings might actually be interested in working with us, which is awesome. It might just be a long lead in for you to be able to make that happen, both from the client side and from the sibling side. And I'd say having a really focused thing, like this is a shared goal, and this shared goal is really only attainable with these people contributing to it. We can do this much on our own, but with these others involved, that would be really cool. Sorry, and then another question, is there something you might change in your approach for a sibling who won't be in a caretaking role, not living with them as opposed to parent? Yeah, and I think all of that's a big topic. So how you would adapt for a sibling relationship versus a parent relationship who's in a caretaking role, I think it comes back to the functioning piece and the shared goal. My first example was a sibling not in a caretaking role, but was creating a lot of problems within their relationship. And the second example was a family in a caretaking role. So we can be certainly thinking about this, and siblings have been much overlooked in this field. So it's very important that we think about how we can include them.
I also want to acknowledge that Chuck Finucchi, who's our CBTP lead at Valley Cities and is on the call, had developed a didactic previously on the topic of involving natural supports in CBTP. And so, Chuck, you've done research in this topic. Anything that you want to highlight, or any questions that you have, or other thoughts we should consider?
The one thing I was wondering about is, how do you make the decision about when to refer for family therapy? What sort of things do you look for?
So I would say if we end up in the session moving more towards the system rather than the individual, which I think can be a hard differential to establish, but if we end up speaking more about the whole system rather than how do we support this individual, that might be necessary. Thinking about a woman that I'm working with at the moment who I've brought the family and husband to support, and now we're getting into relationship issues. And I recognize I'm very much aligned with her. And actually, for me to work with her and her husband, I think would be counterproductive. And so that to me is a family therapy referral, where the therapist needs to be neutral and unbiased as opposed to I'm on her side, right? That's not going to be very helpful. So if we feel that shift here, this is about the relationship and the whole family rather than this is supporting the individual, that would be my referral to the family therapy. And if it becomes, with those ad hoc meetings, if it becomes more frequent, and again, we're really addressing the relationship rather than specific problems, I think family therapy, but I would want to work with that family therapist and collaborate.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you. We have to move on, but I just want to, I think the point of emphasis for me on that didactic was really the formulation and the work to develop that formulation collaboratively with the client, and to bring the family in and as warranted to share that with them, because it's something that oftentimes I think we've discussed formulation so many times on this clinic. It can be a really scary word because it feels so big, but we need to hone in on these mini formulations to see what's contributing to this specific problem or this specific dynamic. And so you did a really nice job of highlighting how you would do that and then how you would bring the family into that process.
Cool.
So thank you.
Thank you.